The Appalachian Trail is a haven for adventurers, stretching over 2,000 miles of rugged beauty from Georgia to Maine. Yet, beneath its serene exterior, it harbors tales that haunt even the most seasoned hikers. Here is one such story, a chilling account whispered around campfires and tucked away in the folds of the mountains. In the autumn of 1999, a seasoned hiker named Michael embarked on a solo journey through the Appalachian Trail. Known for his meticulous planning and experience, Michael was no stranger to the wilderness. This time, his goal was to complete the Smoky Mountain stretch, a particularly remote and challenging segment. The first few days were uneventful. The leaves painted the forest in fiery shades of red and orange, and the crisp air carried the scent of damp earth. Michael documented his journey in a leather-bound journal, sketching the scenery and recording thoughts on his solitude. However, as he ventured deeper into the mountains, his entries grew erratic. On the fourth night, he camped near a shelter known locally as Devil's Rest. It was an abandoned structure, weathered and sagging, far from the official trail. Stories surrounded the place. Rumors of a massacre during the Civil War, of travelers who vanished without a trace. But Michael was not superstitious. He set up his tent just outside the shelter, finding humor in the unsettling tales. That night, the forest was unnaturally quiet. The usual symphony of crickets and distant owls had faded into an oppressive silence. As Michael lay in his sleeping bag, a faint sound reached his ears. It was a low, guttural hum, almost like chanting, carried by the wind. Sitting up, he strained to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from all directions. He wrote in his journal, "Heard something strange tonight. Probably just the wind through the trees. Oddly rhythmic, though. We'll investigate in the morning." The next day, he searched the area but found nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging it off, he pressed onward. Yet the forest seemed different, darker, denser, as if the trees themselves leaned closer together, conspiring to trap him. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and that night the chanting returned. Louder this time. Clearer. Michael described it as a series of overlapping voices, speaking a language he couldn't recognize. When he shone his flashlight into the darkness, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the soft crunch of leaves, as if something or someone was circling his camp. He clutched his knife, heart pounding, but nothing emerged from the black void beyond his firelight. On the sixth day, Michael's journal entries became frantic. "Something is following me. I see it at the edge of the trail, always just out of focus. A figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes. I called out, but it didn't respond. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I tried to shake it off, but it's still there. Always there." That night, he abandoned the trail and bushwhacked into the forest, desperate to lose whatever was stalking him. But the deeper he went, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to grow in impossible shapes, their trunks twisted like tortured bodies. He stumbled upon small, crudely built shrines made of bones and twigs, their purpose unknowable. By the eighth day, his journal stopped describing his journey and instead became a plea for help. "To whoever finds this, do not stay here. Do not listen to the voices. They are in my head now. They tell me things, terrible things. They want me to join them. I can't leave. It won't let me. The forest itself won't let me." Michael's body was discovered months later by a group of hikers. He was perched in a tree, his skeletal frame wedged between the branches as if placed there deliberately. His journal lay open on the ground beneath him, its last page smeared with what appeared to be blood. The final entry was a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting: "The forest is hungry." To this day, hikers avoid Devil's Rest, and the few who dare to pass through speak of a suffocating sense of dread. Some claim to hear the chanting, faint but persistent, drifting through the trees. Others report glimpses of a figure, always just out of focus, watching them with hollow eyes. And so the Appalachian Trail keeps its secrets, its beauty masking a darkness older than the mountains themselves. If you ever find yourself walking its lonely paths, remember Michael's warning. Some places are not meant to be explored. Some trails lead not to adventure, but to oblivion.
Story number 2.
In 2013, a group of 4 college friends, Jenna, Alex, Mark, and Sophia, decided to spend their spring break hiking the Appalachian Trail. They were inexperienced but eager, armed with shiny new gear and a poorly thought-out plan. Their goal was to hike through Virginia's Grayson Highlands, famous for its wild ponies and sweeping vistas. The first 2 days were idyllic. The weather was perfect, the scenery breathtaking, and the group felt invincible. They laughed around campfires, swapped ghost stories, and marveled at the stars. But on the third night, things began to unravel. The group set up camp near an old fire tower, long abandoned and half hidden by the encroaching forest. It was Jenna who noticed the first oddity, a series of symbols carved into the wood of the tower. They were jagged and crude, spiraling in a nonsensical pattern. Mark joked it was hillbilly graffiti, but Sophia, who studied anthropology, seemed uneasy. "These aren't random," she said, tracing her fingers over the carvings. "They're deliberate, ritualistic." "Ritualistic for what?" Alex teased. "Summoning Bigfoot?" Sophia didn't answer. That night, the group huddled in their tents, the fire casting flickering shadows against the trees. Jenna awoke to a sound outside, branches snapping, footsteps crunching. She unzipped her tent, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Just as she was about to lie back down, she heard it. A whisper, faint and raspy, coming from the direction of the fire tower. "Help me." The voice was weak, barely audible, but distinctly human. Jenna froze, her breath hitching. She called out, "Who's there?" No response, only silence. In the morning, she told the others. Alex laughed it off, but Mark frowned. "I heard something too. Footsteps. Thought it was one of you guys, but..." He trailed off. They decided to move on, leaving the fire tower and its strange carvings behind, but the whispers followed them. By the fifth day, they were all hearing it, faint voices calling out from the forest. Sometimes it was a woman sobbing, other times a child laughing, but always just out of sight. The woods, once serene, now felt oppressive, the trees closing in like prison bars. The trail itself seemed to shift. Landmarks they had passed hours ago reappeared ahead as if the forest were looping back on itself. Then came the night of the screaming. They had pitched their tents in a clearing, exhaustion weighing heavily on their spirits. Around midnight, a blood-curdling scream tore through the stillness. It wasn't human, too guttural, too raw, but it echoed with a primal rage that sent chills down their spines. Jenna scrambled out of her tent, flashlight trembling in her hand, and saw Sophia standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the woods. "Sophia, what are you doing?" Jenna whispered. Sophia didn't respond. She stepped into the trees, her movements stiff, as if pulled by an unseen force. Jenna rushed to grab her, but froze when she saw Sophia's face. Her eyes were wide and blank, her mouth moving silently. Jenna shook her, shouting her name, and Sophia suddenly collapsed, unconscious. When Sophia woke hours later, she couldn't remember anything. But the others noticed something was wrong. Her demeanor had changed. She was withdrawn, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. That night, while the others slept, she began speaking in her sleep, her voice low and guttural. Mark shook her awake, and she stared at him with wide, unseeing eyes. "They're coming," she whispered. "They want us to stay." The group decided to abandon their hike and head back, but the forest had other plans. No matter which direction they went, they ended up back at the clearing. Desperation set in as the whispers grew louder, the voices now mocking them, calling their names. On the seventh day, Alex disappeared. They woke to find his tent empty, his pack still there. They searched for hours, calling his name, but the forest swallowed their voices. Jenna found his flashlight near a stream, its lens cracked and smeared with blood. They camped that night in terrified silence, huddled together in a single tent. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of laughter, screams, and sobbing that circled their camp. The next morning, Sophia was gone. They found her standing in the same spot she had collapsed days earlier, her head tilted toward the fire tower, her lips moving silently. When Jenna approached, Sophia turned to her and smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. Then, without a word, she ran into the woods, her laughter echoing long after she disappeared. Jenna and Mark managed to escape the forest 2 days later, though neither could explain how. They stumbled into a ranger station, filthy and delirious, babbling about the voices and the fire tower. A search party was sent out, but found no trace of Alex or Sophia. The rangers dismissed their story as hysteria, claiming they had simply gotten lost, but Jenna knew the truth. Something ancient, something malevolent lurked in those woods, and it was still watching. She never went hiking again.
Story number 3.
In the late summer of 2006, a young woman named Rachel decided to take on the Appalachian Trail solo, a journey she hoped would give her clarity after a tumultuous breakup. She was experienced, having tackled numerous wilderness treks before, and confident in her ability to handle anything the trail threw her way. However, she wasn't prepared for the trail to fight back. Rachel started her hike near Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, intending to head north. For the first week, her days were peaceful, filled with sunlight filtering through the trees and the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the dirt path. But on the 8th day, the peace shattered. She was camping near a popular shelter when she noticed something strange. A man stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the tree line. He was motionless, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood, though the late afternoon sun made it warm enough to go without one. Rachel called out a friendly greeting, but the man didn't respond. Feeling uneasy, she turned her back to him for only a moment to stoke her campfire. When she looked again, he was gone. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her ears picked up faint noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but every time she peeked outside her tent, the woods were still. The next day, Rachel pushed herself to cover more miles, trying to shake the strange encounter. But as she set up camp that evening, her unease grew. In the fading light, she found footprints circling the area where she'd pitched her tent, large boot prints that weren't hers. She told herself they must have been old, left by another hiker, but deep down, she knew they hadn't been there when she first arrived. That night, the noises returned, louder this time. Around midnight, she heard a soft scratching against the side of her tent. Her heart raced as she grabbed her knife and flashlight, ready to confront whatever it was. But when she burst out of the tent, there was nothing there, just the still, silent forest. The only clue was a long tear in the fabric of her tent, as though someone had dragged a knife across it. By now, Rachel was terrified but determined to press on. She avoided shelters, opting for hidden, hard-to-reach campsites far off the main trail. She stopped cooking at night, fearing the smell of food would attract unwanted attention. Still, the feeling of being watched never left her. On the 12th day, she stumbled upon something chilling. Near a creek where she stopped to refill her water, she found a small pile of stones, meticulously stacked in a pyramid. A single flower, a daisy, was placed on top. The sight was unnerving, but what froze her blood was the object sitting beside the stones. A dirty scrap of fabric from her torn tent. She abandoned the trail that day, ignoring her itinerary and heading straight for the nearest town. But even as she hiked, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Several times, she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. A flash of a shadow, the glint of light on metal. And once, as she crossed a narrow ridge, she distinctly heard a man's laughter, low and guttural, echoing through the valley below. She reached a small town just before dusk, stumbling into a diner and explaining her ordeal to a concerned waitress. The local police were called, and though they searched the area where she claimed to have been followed, they found no signs of anyone. Rachel's story might have been dismissed as paranoia if not for what they found 2 weeks later. A pair of hikers reported a campsite a few miles from where Rachel had been. Abandoned, but eerily staged. Inside the tent was a doll, crudely made of twigs and twine, with its head wrapped in the same fabric torn from Rachel's tent. Around the doll were more stacked stone pyramids, each topped with a daisy. No one ever identified the man Rachel had seen. Some locals speculate he was a drifter. Others claim he was something far worse, an entity that preys on solitary travelers. Rachel never returned to the trail, and the story of the Trail Watcher remains one of the most unsettling legends of the Appalachian wilderness.
Story number 4.
In the fall of 2015, a newlywed couple, Sarah and Ethan, decided to celebrate their honeymoon with an ambitious hike along the Appalachian Trail. They were avid outdoors enthusiasts, excited to disconnect from the chaos of the world and immerse themselves in nature. They planned to complete a 2-week loop through a remote section of the trail near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. The first few days were idyllic. The crisp autumn air, the fiery red and orange leaves, and the serene solitude of the mountains were everything they'd dreamed of. But as they ventured deeper into the trail, the wilderness began to change. On the 5th day, they came across an old, weathered sign nailed to a tree. It read, "Turn back. This path is not for you." Ethan laughed it off, calling it a prank left by a previous hiker. But Sarah felt uneasy. The sign didn't seem like a joke. It looked old, the wood rotting and the paint faded as though it had been there for decades. Still, they pressed on. That evening, they camped near a ridge with a spectacular view of the valley below. As they sat by the fire, Sarah thought she heard faint singing. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably melodic. She asked Ethan if he heard it, but he shrugged it off as the wind. Later, when she unzipped the tent to look outside, the singing had stopped. The woods were eerily still. The next morning, they discovered something strange. Just outside their campsite was a set of footprints, large and barefoot, circling their tent. The prints were deep, as though whoever or whatever had made them was unusually heavy. Ethan tried to reassure Sarah, saying it was probably just a curious animal, but the tension between them grew. As the days went on, the trail became harder to follow. The trees seemed closer together, their twisted branches blocking the sun. Several times, they came across more signs, all with cryptic warnings. You are not welcome. Leave before it's too late. By the 9th day, they were hopelessly lost. Their map no longer seemed to match the terrain, and their GPS failed to pick up a signal. The singing returned that night, louder and closer. This time, Ethan heard it too. It didn't sound human. They didn't sleep. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made their hearts race. Around midnight, Sarah swore she saw a figure standing among the trees, a tall, emaciated silhouette with glowing eyes. She screamed, and when Ethan shone his flashlight in the direction, there was nothing there. The following day, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. Its roof sagged, and its windows were shattered, but they were desperate for shelter. Inside, the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols etched into the wood with meticulous precision. On the floor was a pile of bones, small, like those of animals, but arranged in intricate patterns. Ethan wanted to leave immediately, but Sarah pointed out that they needed to rest and regroup. As night fell, they barricaded the door and windows as best they could. But the singing returned, surrounding the cabin, echoing from every direction. It was no longer faint. It was loud, oppressive, and otherworldly. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate strokes against the cabin walls, as though something with claws was tracing the markings. The couple huddled together, clutching their knives as the sounds grew more aggressive. A low, guttural growl joined the singing, and then the cabin door began to rattle. "Who's there?" Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. The only response was laughter, deep, resonant, and inhuman. In a panic, they grabbed their packs and fled into the night, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as they ran. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at them, roots tripping their steps. Behind them, the singing and laughter followed, never fading, never slowing. By dawn, they stumbled onto a dirt road, collapsing in exhaustion. A passing hunter found them and drove them to the nearest town. They tried to explain what had happened, but their story was met with skepticism. Local authorities searched the area but found no trace of the cabin, the footprints, or the strange signs. Sarah and Ethan never returned to the Appalachian Trail. To this day, they suffer from vivid nightmares of the singing and the glowing eyes. Locals, however, aren't surprised. That stretch of trail has long been avoided, rumored to be cursed. It's said to be a place where the forest doesn't want you to leave, where something ancient and malevolent waits for those who dare to trespass. And sometimes it doesn't let them go.
Story number 5.
In the spring of 2004, a hiker named Daniel, a quiet man in his mid-30s, set out to complete the Appalachian Trail from start to finish. He was seeking solitude, a way to heal after losing his wife in a car accident. The trail seemed like the perfect escape, a chance to disappear into nature and leave his grief behind. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. Daniel kept to himself, rarely stopping to chat with other hikers. He preferred the company of the trail and the sound of his own footsteps. But as he moved deeper into the wilderness, he began to feel something strange, a sensation that he wasn't truly alone. It started subtly. On his third week, he found strange markings carved into the trees along the trail. They weren't initials or dates, like hikers often left behind, but intricate, spiraling symbols. At first, he thought they were left by some eccentric artist, but the further he hiked, the more frequent and elaborate the carvings became. By the fourth week, Daniel noticed something else. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The bird song and rustling leaves that had accompanied him for miles were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. He tried to shake it off, but that night as he lay in his tent, he heard it for the first time, a distant sound like the faint wail of a child. He froze, straining his ears. It came again, louder this time, echoing through the forest. It was unmistakably a child crying. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of his tent. The sound was coming from deeper in the woods, away from the trail. Against his better judgment, he called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. He waited, his heart pounding, but the forest was silent once more. He returned to his tent, convinced it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. The next morning, Daniel found something unnerving. Around his campsite were tiny handprints in the dirt, as though a child had been walking barefoot in circles around his tent. The prints led back into the woods, disappearing among the trees. He packed up quickly, is eager to move on, but the crying followed him. Every night, without fail, it began again, distant at first, then growing louder, closer. On the seventh night, the crying gave way to laughter, high-pitched and chilling, echoing from all directions. He shouted into the darkness, begging it to stop, but the laughter only grew louder. The next day, Daniel came across a small clearing. In the center was an old well, its stones crumbling and covered in moss. Something about it felt wrong, like the air around it was heavier, colder. As he approached, he saw that the spiraling symbols were etched into the stones of the well. And then he heard it again, the crying coming from deep within the well. Daniel peered into the darkness, his flashlight barely illuminating the bottom. He saw nothing but damp stone walls. He turned to leave, but froze when he heard a voice, faint and echoing. "Help me." It was a child's voice, weak and trembling. Daniel's instincts told him to run, but guilt rooted him to the spot. What if someone was trapped down there? Against his better judgment, he called out, "I'm here. I'll get help." The voice responded, closer now. "Don't leave me." The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The voice wasn't coming from the well anymore. It was behind him. Daniel spun around, but the clearing was empty. He ran, not stopping until his legs gave out. That night, he set up camp far from the well, like his nerves frayed. But the crying returned, louder than ever, echoing just beyond the reach of his flashlight. The next morning, Daniel found the symbols carved into the bark of every tree around his campsite. The carvings seemed fresh, the edges raw and splintered. He didn't stop to inspect them. He just ran. When Daniel finally reached a town, he was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow. He told his story to a park ranger, who listened with a skeptical but concerned expression. The ranger explained that the well he described didn't exist on any map, and there were no reports of missing children in the area. Desperate for closure, Daniel returned to the trail months later, determined to find the clearing and prove he wasn't crazy. He spent days retracing his steps, but the well was gone. The spiraling symbols, the eerie silence, even the handprints, there was no trace of any of it. Locals believe Daniel stumbled into a part of the trail where the veil between worlds is thin, a place where lost souls wander and ancient things linger. Some hikers claim to have heard the crying, faint and far away, but none have dared to follow it. Daniel never returned to the Appalachian Trail. To this day, he wakes in the middle of the night, hearing the faint sound of a child crying just outside his window.
Story number 6.
In the autumn of 2019, a seasoned hiker named Caleb set out to complete a lesser-known stretch of the Appalachian Trail near the Smoky Mountains. Caleb prided himself on his ability to handle even the most remote parts of the trail. He had survived bad weather, close encounters with wildlife, and even a broken ankle during one of his solo trips. But nothing could prepare him for what he would encounter this time. On his third day, he reached a section of the trail that was less maintained, overgrown with thick vegetation. He'd heard rumors from other hikers about a ghost trail that branched off here, an unmarked path that supposedly led to nowhere. Most people dismissed it as a myth, but Caleb decided to keep an eye out for it, more out of curiosity than belief. As the sun dipped low, Caleb noticed something strange. A faint, narrow trail veering off to the left, almost hidden by the underbrush. The hairs on his arms stood on end as he stared at it. Something about the path felt wrong. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive, as if the forest were holding its breath. Against his better judgment, Caleb decided to investigate. The path was eerie, with trees so tightly packed they formed a tunnel overhead. The deeper he went, the darker it became, even though the sun hadn't fully set. The only sounds were his own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig beneath his boots. After an hour of walking, Caleb realized he was completely disoriented. The trail had twisted and turned so many times that he couldn't tell which direction he had come from. When he checked his GPS, it showed no signal. Worse, his compass needles spun aimlessly as if the forest had somehow disrupted it. He decided to turn back, but the path seemed different, narrower, more overgrown. Panic crept in as he realized he couldn't find the way he'd come. Night fell quickly, the darkness pressing in around him like a living thing. He set up his tent on the path itself, not daring to step off into the thick woods. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. The forest was unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of crickets or distant animal calls. Around midnight, he heard it, the faint sound of a woman humming. The melody was soft and haunting, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaky. The humming stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. He shone his flashlight into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the dense foliage. "Who's there?" he shouted. The footsteps stopped. Caleb held his breath, straining to hear. Then, out of the darkness, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft but clear, and it sent chills down his spine. Caleb scrambled back into his tent, clutching his knife and flashlight. He stayed awake all night, jumping at every sound, but nothing else happened. When dawn broke, Caleb wasted no time packing up. He walked for hours, desperate to find the main trail, but the ghost path seemed endless. He began to notice strange things: trees with deep gouges that looked like claw marks, piles of stones arranged in unnatural patterns, and most disturbingly, a string of deer skulls hanging from the branches, their empty sockets staring down at him. By midday, he heard the humming again. It was closer this time, accompanied by the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and childlike. Caleb started running, ignoring the branches that scratched his face and arms. The humming grew louder, as if it were coming from all around him. Suddenly, the path ended in a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like skeletal fingers. Hanging from the tree was a single swing made of frayed rope and a wooden plank. It swayed gently, though there was no wind. As Caleb approached, he saw something etched into the tree's bark. "We see you." The humming stopped. The silence was deafening, the air so heavy it felt like he was suffocating. Then, just behind him, a voice whispered in his ear, "Run." Caleb didn't look back. He sprinted through the forest, tearing through the underbrush until he burst onto the main trail. He didn't stop until he reached a shelter several miles away, collapsing in exhaustion. When other hikers arrived later, they found him pale and trembling, unable to explain what had happened. Caleb never hiked alone again. When he told his story to the locals, one old man nodded grimly. "You found the ghost trail," he said. "It doesn't let everyone leave." To this day, Caleb swears he hears the humming in his dreams, growing louder each time.
Story number 7.
In the summer of 2018, two college friends, Emily and Ben, decided to spend their break hiking the Appalachian Trail. Both were seasoned hikers, eager to test their endurance and reconnect with nature. They chose a less traveled section of the trail in western Virginia, an area known for its rugged beauty and isolation. On the third day of their trip, they encountered an older man sitting by a fire at a campsite. His clothes were tattered and his face was gaunt, but his demeanor was friendly. He introduced himself as Arthur and claimed he'd been living off the trail for years. Emily and Ben were a bit uneasy, but joined him for a quick meal, sharing stories and enjoying the warmth of the fire. Before they left, Arthur warned them, "Be careful up ahead. The forest doesn't always let people through." They laughed it off, assuming it was just the ramblings of an eccentric hermit. But the further they hiked, the stranger things became. That evening, they pitched their tent in a small clearing. As the sun set, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. There were no bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. Around midnight, Ben woke up to the sound of something scratching against the tent fabric. He froze, listening. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was dragging claws across the nylon. He whispered to Emily, who woke up startled. Grabbing their flashlight, they burst out of the tent, but there was nothing there. The ground around the tent was undisturbed, no tracks or signs of animals. They chalked it up to exhaustion and paranoia, but both of them found it hard to fall back asleep. The next day, the trail seemed unfamiliar, even though they'd been following their map closely. Trees they didn't recognize appeared, their trunks twisted and gnarled with deep, jagged scars in the bark. Emily commented that the forest felt darker, even in the middle of the day. They began to feel as though they were being watched, though they saw no one. That night, they camped near a stream, hoping the sound of running water would ease their nerves. But the unease only grew. As they prepared their dinner, they noticed the woods were eerily quiet again. Then they saw it. Just beyond the tree line, a figure stood motionless, partially obscured by the shadows. "Hello?" Ben called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Emily shone her flashlight in its direction, but the beam seemed to bend around it as if the darkness itself was protecting it. Then in an instant, the figure was gone. They spent the night huddled in the tent, too terrified to sleep. Around 3 a.m., they heard footsteps circling their camp. Heavy, deliberate steps that stopped and started as though whatever was out there wanted them to know it was close. The following morning, desperate to leave, they packed up and hiked as fast as they could. But no matter how far they went, the landscape seemed unchanged. It was as though they were walking in circles, despite following their compass and map meticulously. Around midday, they found something chilling, a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree. It read, "Turn back." The sign looked ancient. The wood splintered and faded, but the message was clear. They decided to ignore it, pushing forward in the hope of finding their way out. But as night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew so dense that their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the moonlight. That night, the footsteps returned, closer this time. Something brushed against their tent, a low, guttural growl vibrating through the air. Emily and Ben stayed completely still, holding their breaths. Then, without warning, the tent collapsed inward, as if an unseen force had pressed down on it. They scrambled out, shining their flashlight wildly into the darkness. Standing just a few feet away was Arthur. His face was no longer gaunt, but unnaturally stretched, his eyes sunken and glowing faintly in the dark. "You shouldn't have come this far," he said, his voice distorted, almost inhuman. Before they could react, he vanished into the shadows. They didn't stop to pack their gear. They just ran, stumbling through the woods until they reached a road at dawn. A passing car picked them up and took them to a nearby town. When they recounted their story to locals, one older man shook his head grimly. "Arthur's been dead for years," he said. "He was a hiker like you, got lost in those woods. They say the forest took him." Emily and Ben never returned to the Appalachian Trail. Months later, they learned that hikers in that same area had gone missing, their last known location eerily close to where Emily and Ben had seen the sign. To this day, they can't explain what they encountered or how they escaped. But every now and then, Emily dreams of Arthur's face, stretched and glowing, whispering, "You shouldn't have come this far."